Today's webinar, Formative Assessment in Action. I'll just share with you where we're going. Today I'll be asking probably a couple of questions. What exactly is formative assessment? What does it look like in the learning and teaching situation? And what impact does it have on learning? Now, one part of formative assessment in action is not only do we share the learning, and that's what I've put in this slide for today, we also like to share the success criteria with groups of students that we are working with. So here's Gary's success criteria for today. I'm hoping that by the end of this session, you'll know at least one thing you didn't know before about formative assessment. And the second thing is identify one thing you will change about your practice on leaving this session. So two bits of formative assessment in action are very straightforward. You share the learning intentions or the learning aims and objectives with your students, which I'm pretty sure in our sector just about every lecturer does. And identifying one thing you'll change about your practice, we wouldn't be doing our job if we didn't change our practice based on formative assessment practice. But I think if I was to say formative assessment to a group of school teachers, college lecturers, higher education lecturers, I think the one word that would pop into their head is the word feedback. And basically, that's what formative assessment is. Feedback, feedback, feedback. Today, this particular webinar focuses on what does that look like in action as part of the learning situation that's going on in the classroom, the workshop, out in the rural skills farmyard, out on the aquaculture site, but it's very much about formative assessment in action when you're working with the students. What does it look like, and how can we promote good formative assessment that I suppose makes learning better, not just for Gary as the lecturer or you as the lecturer, but also for the students. I think one key message I like to give is if we're really doing formative assessment in action, then it should be about making the students work better and indeed a bit smarter. So these are two bits of formative assessment in action. One thing I would like to do is formative assessment should be something that happens as a natural and intuitive part of the process. So I'd like you to get involved in the webinar today. So just in the chat, what's the most positive work-related experience or result that you've achieved today? So just in the chat box, what pops into your head when I ask that question? Typing. Claire, I really liked what you've posted there. Engaging reluctant students in role play. Yeah, we all know that role play is a really powerful learning tool, but as you say, if you've got reluctant students, it takes a lot of work to get them to that stage. But well done you, and you've used it as a kind of diagnostic assessment tool to work out what they do know and, more importantly, what they didn't know. How good is that? Fantastic. Margaret, feedback I'd given on a piece of work was well received and changes made following now meet standards required. Fantastic, that's a result. You know, that's certainly a good example of nice feedback, changing thinking and practice. Excellent. Thank you, Claire. Thanks, Yolanda. Yes, answering questions. Posing good questions and answering questions are very much part of formative assessment in action. So thank you very much for doing that. You've given me instant feedback on some things you've done today. What's Gary's most positive thing he's achieved today? I support students who are doing their teaching qualification and further education, and today I have proofread three assignments before they submit it to the university. as their final piece of work, and I'm so proud of what they've achieved, and it's just a nice part of the job. And the other thing I've achieved today is I've completed 2 observation reports on colleagues who are undertaking their PDA teaching in Scotland's colleges, and they were absolutely fabulous, and it was just a great opportunity for me to give fabulous positive feedback to colleagues in the sector. So thank you very much for doing that. Did you know that the Standards for College Lectures mentions the word feedback 30 times? So formative assessment, feedback is a really powerful word in our professional standards. The good news is that College Development Network's just about to trigger the refresh of the professional standards for college lecturers. That's both the initial standards and the CPD standards. The initial college standards, college lecturer standards, are well out of date now. They were 2012 and they're due for refresh this year. We're just a way to start that process. And the CPD ones are even more out of date. They were last updated in 2006. So I'm going to make sure that we have quite a bit more content on formative assessment in our refresh standards. Some of you will have seen this pyramid before. It's called the Learning Pyramid, and really I just wanted to include that just to re-emphasise, we know the basics, that learning is a collaborative process, it's a social process, and we learn more by doing stuff and having professional conversations, professional discussions around learning. And you'll see there that at the top of the pyramid, you've probably got more passive types of learning, whereas you get to the base of the pyramid, it's much more collaborative and interactive, and certainly formative assessment strategies and techniques definitely fall into that latter part, the bottom part of the pyramid. So what exactly is formative assessment? In the learning and teaching situation, it's providing developmental and incremental feedback to students so that they can adjust their plan for future learning, so that they can improve, they can improve the work that they have to submit, but also that they can improve as part of their performance in the classroom setting. And it occurs naturally and intuitively as part of the learning and teaching process. I think that's the real strong point of formative assessment in action. It's not about having to do anything in addition. It's not extra work. It really does just happen as we are engaging, clarifying, elaborating, answering questions of our students. And I think the big thing for me is formative assessment as part of our questioning techniques really does encourage that higher order and critical thinking skills. I was doing an observation yesterday in a photography studio, and the lecturer was really coaxing the answers out of these students, really giving them high-powered questions, both to get them to problem solve, but also to be a bit more higher order and critical in their thinking. So for me, formative assessment and action are good questions that really coax quite high-level answers out of our students. So it's not anything complicated. For me, formative assessment is what happens as part of the learning and teaching process. There are 4 basic elements to formative assessment in action. I've modelled the first one of those, sharing the learning goals. Right at the beginning I said today this is where we're going with the webinar, but it's also about sharing the success criteria with your students as well. What a good one looks like almost, or this is what I'm looking for, and that's just the basic success criteria. And I always like to share with my students, this is what I'm looking for, this is what a good one looks like, here's the success criteria, so that when we do get into peer and self-assessment, they know what to feed back on. It's also about effective questioning. I've done a whole series of webinars on effective questioning techniques, so I'm not going to go there. But formative assessment in action is posing good questions, but also using the responses that you get back from your students to elaborate and clarify their thinking. It's also about self and peer evaluation, and I've also, Margaret said in the chat box there that she's given, feedback herself, but all three of you who are listening today will involve your students in self and peer evaluation, and of course the F word, effective feedback. And at the bottom there, I've just said it's interaction with the lecturer, students with each other, and also interaction with the resources, which is what goes on in a good FE classroom, workshop, hospitality suite, out in the farmyard, out in the aquaculture marine site, or whatever. That's the key word: interaction, participation with lecturer, each other, and the resources. I put a small graphic of a bridge in there. I like my analogy of a bridge because you'll see the two pillars of the bridge there. A pillar on the left hand side, that's where they are. The second pillar is where you want them to be, and in order to do that, we have to close the gap, or I prefer the term bridge the gap. And for me, bridging that gap is the quality of the feedback, that developmental and incremental feedback that I have just visualized there as a bridge. Some of you may have heard me saying that feedback should be like a good murder. There should be motive for the feedback, there should be opportunity for the students to use the feedback, and it should be timed. I prefer my own acronym of PACT, P-A-C-T, that when you're giving feedback as part of formative assessment in action, you should think of the PACT acronym. P stands for pertinent, so any effective feedback should be pertinent and relevant. The A, it should be actionable. There should be action points, and I'll come back to that when I'm giving feedback to my students. As well as the feedback, I like to include 2 or 3 action points that are achievable. C, it should be concise, and T, it should be timed, just like the graphic there. So I like my acronym that I've developed for effective feedback: PACT, pertinent, actionable, concise, and timed. So just before I stop for some feedback from yourself, I would just like to say one thing that I read from a piece of research on formative assessment by the real gurus, the real expert, Dillon and Williams. They, I suppose, are the recognised gurus of formative assessment. When I was reading some of their work earlier on, they said the only thing that matters about feedback, and I like this, you'll have your own views, but it should be more work for the student than Gary or Claire or Margaret or Yolanda, and it should also be what the students do with the feedback, and how the students react to the feedback will depend on the quality of the working relationships. Those of you who are working on a daily basis with students, you know that if you have a positive working relationship with your students, then the students will react in a positive way to your feedback. But for me, the only thing that matters is what the students do with it. So I'm going to pause there for just a couple of minutes before and if you have to stop and think about it, we maybe make heavy weather of it. Yes, and I'm very fortunate that I get to observe our colleagues in action with groups of students, and they are doing it naturally and intuitively, so that's a nice point. Margaret, I love the idea of more work for the student than the lecturer. Yep, I like that one too, so thank you for that. I'm glad you like that. Okay, moving on then, let's just, I've got the last 3 slides here are just some tips and techniques about formative assessment in action. Thanks, Claire. Yeah, objectives and success criteria. Yeah, that's, again, it's just reassuring to know that you do that as a matter of course. It's in our DNA as teachers and lecturers. There's absolutely no doubt about that. Okay, based on the work of Dillon and Williams and some Scottish pieces of research, essential elements of formative assessment, I've picked out probably maybe 6 to 9 that I use, and it's easy to model as part of the learning and teaching process. So formative assessment in action, peer feedback, that's the most obvious one. College lecturers, HE lecturers and school teachers, they do that automatically without thinking. We use, for example, I was again observing a colleague yesterday and they were looking at flash photography and they were all creating images. What the lecturer did was brought them all back together in the plenary session, put the group images up, and they all gave fantastic peer feedback on the images. And do you know what? It was just absolutely brilliant. They were fantastic. They started with the positives and then went on to could be better if. And that's a nice question when you're trying to get them to do peer feedback. What could be better if? So, peer feedback's an obvious one. That's formative assessment in action. One that I've tried, I was quite sceptical, but it actually did work. Strengths and development needs of work before submission. I'm doing this with colleagues who are undertaking their TQFE and their PDA at the moment, and on the certain sections of the work that they're submitting to me for feedback, before I do anything with it, I ask them the question, what are the strengths and development needs of this piece of work that you're submitting to me? And it gets the professional dialogue, it gets the learning conversation going about their work, and certainly done that with students in the past. Another one I like is ask the students what kind of feedback they welcome most when they submit. That is fascinating. You get a whole range of answers. The funniest answer I've had is, that's your job, Gary. But once we work on it and we build it into the process, it's amazing what they come back with, and it does all that stuff that we hear about involving students in their learning, but it also involves students in the assessment process. So when we get that question, how do we involve students in the assessment process? You ask for feedback that they would welcome most. Feedback, comments, discussion with peers. Yes, sometimes I put them into groups and we look at the feedback comments, and it's the structured group work that looks at the feedback comments, and that can be quite powerful as well. And what I like to do is the students to identify a piece of feedback they found helpful and explain why. That gets good conversations about learning. Going back to the learning pyramid in the early part of the presentation, that gets good discussion going. And formative assessment in action are really good, focused discussions about learning. So I hope that's reassuring you on that slide that you do these things anyway. There might be one or two that you haven't tried before, but you might want to try. Again, another example of formative assessment in action. Does what you have asked them to create, develop, write, present, communicate, does it meet the success criteria? That's quite fascinating as well. If you have time, does what you have created meet the success criteria? And that gets really good learning discussion going. You will all do the next one. I just put that in because it's something we do intuitively. Exemplar assignments with feedback. Next one, exercises where students reflect on peer work against success criteria. So they swap the work. They're the success criteria. Does it match the success criteria? That's really interesting because the students are probably harder on the work that's been put forward for success criteria matching than possibly myself. It gets really interesting discussion and debate going. Lecturers note clear action points along with comments. Yes. Part of my PACT acronym, I've got to model that. So how do I do that? I put one or two action points along with the comments, because if you've got a lot of comments, which is good, it's developmental and incremental, but if you have clear action points, then that is another nice example of formative assessment in action. And one there, students identify their own action points based on your feedback. That's an interesting assessment, formative assessment in action as well, where you ask them to engage with your feedback and to possibly craft their own action points. I think that gets higher order thinking skills going amongst our students. And then my final one is slides there. This is quite powerful. Providing marks or pass-fail on written work only after students have responded to the comments that you have provided on their written work. So you give them the written work back, they read through your feedback, and then you decide or ask them, has this met the success criteria? Has this been successful? 1 minute papers, I've put that in because that's a natural and intuitive part of the classroom situation. I love 1 minute papers, and that's what I tried to do with you earlier on in the webinar. What's the immediate thing that's popped into your head as a result of what I have been suggesting? Another one I like is, what's been the most important part of this input in the last 10-15 minutes? Or what's the most important point I've made in this lecture? What's the most important thing I have done in this demonstration or in this piece of instruction? I love 1 minute papers. It's really interesting what comes back from the students. And again, not to over-egg the pudding, because I've done a whole raft of webinars on questioning, but I sometimes drop into the classroom situation. Can you come up with a question that's worth asking on the learning that Gary has either instructed, demonstrated, or set up? So I like that. Develop a question worth asking on the input that Gary has been giving. So, formative assessment in action then. I've not put it on the presentation, but if we have formative assessment in action, some of the techniques that I've highlighted there, what is the benefit for learning? What's benefit for learning for students? What's benefit for learning of the teachers, lecturers, and academics, depending where you do most of your work? Formative assessment in action gives you structured reflection. The last 3 slides, it does put a structure. It puts a scaffold round for them to think, to reflect, to evaluate on their their learning. I like that. Second benefit is you get good feedback dialogue in your learning and teaching sessions. Anything that generates learning dialogue is good formative assessment in action. The third benefit it has, it clarifies your criteria, your standards and goals with your students. The external feedback that you give helps to not close the gap. We hear a lot of that expression. We want to close the attainment gap, close the learning gap. For me, it's about bridging it, because for some of the students I work with, sometimes I will never close the gap, but I certainly will bridge that gap. Number 5, it makes me think about the quality of feedback that I'm giving, all the techniques that I highlighted there. Having learning conversations and identifying strengths and development needs, it boosts motivation, it boosts self-esteem, and anybody in a learning situation knows that when you're given feedback, you start with the strengths and development needs, you do boost their self-esteem, their motivation, their confidence. I would also add their perseverance and their resilience. So, the feedback techniques that we've highlighted today, I think, can do that. And finally, for me as a lecturer or a teacher, formative assessment in action allows me to gather information, a whole rich tapestry of qualitative data that gives immediate feedback to me, so that I can plan the next learning steps for how I'm going to plan the delivery of the next learning steps. But equally important, where the students have got development needs, where there are some gaps in their knowledge and their understanding or their skill development. So it allows me to gather information on that. So there are absolutely 7 clear benefits of formative assessment in action, and I'm pretty sure that Claire, Margaret and Yolanda, who are listening today, will do that routinely and intuitively. So I have to model what I practice. So I'm going to go back to my success criteria on the screen there. Thank you very much, Claire. That's heartening to read. I've certainly been guilty of that in the past by giving a whole long list of action points with the feedback, and for some of my students, the signal probably gets lost in the noise. So thank you for putting that into the chat box. Yeah, we do tend to give a lot of feed forward. Um, yeah, as well as feedback, we do have this concept called feed forward, and there's another one apparently called feed up. Um, I'm not sure I like that one, but I can certainly live with feed forward. Feed up, not sure. We're supposed to be a health promoting nation, so maybe it's not a good term. Thank you, Yolanda. I didn't know about the teaching pyramid and how this will affect the type of feedback. Thank you so much. You will, as George said earlier, you will get the presentation, so you'll be able to see that. And thank you, Margaret. That's really nice of you to say. Sharing your formative assessments are focused on the success criteria. Yes, linked, I think that is a real feature of formative assessment in action, where the feedback is also linked back to your learning objectives or your aims or your intentions, whatever language you use with your students. But let's not forget it should be linked to the success criteria as well. So thank you very much for that. And I noticed that Yolanda is typing, so we'll just wait on Yolanda's point coming in, and then I'll take some questions if there are any. And thank you, Margaret and Claire, too. Your comments in the chat box have reassured me that you have not wasted the last 30 minutes. So thank you very much indeed. Um, just